The truth no one saw in Amy Winehouse's collapse is that it didn't begin with the drugs, the scandals, or even the headlines. It began with the very gift that made her unforgettable: her voice. A voice that carried raw pain, timeless soul, and a kind of truth you couldn't fake. But behind that sound was a young woman quietly losing her own. Her downfall wasn't just the story of another star gone too soon, or another member of the 27 Club. It was the story of how a fragile person was crushed under the weight of talent, love, and a culture that celebrated her destruction as much as her success. And that's what makes Amy's story so haunting. Because what the world mourned in 2011 wasn't just one of the greatest voices of a generation. It was a woman erased by expectations, wounds, and a spotlight that refused to let her breathe. Long before the world knew her music, Amy Winehouse was already living with fractures that shaped her life. She was born in 1983 in London, into a family filled with the sounds of jazz and soul, but also with tension that seeped into the walls. When her parents divorced at just 9 years old, the ground beneath her shifted. For a child, the end of a marriage isn't just two parents living apart. It's the sudden loss of certainty, the feeling that home can no longer promise safety. From that moment, Amy carried a deep awareness that love could break apart, and when it did, nothing around her felt steady anymore. Psychologists explain this through what's called attachment theory. When children grow up in unstable homes, they often carry that instability into adult life. They may look for partners who give them the same mix of love and chaos they knew as kids. It isn't a conscious choice. It's a pattern the heart repeats, trying to solve the old wound. Later in life, Amy's relationships, often stormy and painful, showed how deeply this early fracture followed her. As she grew older, those inner struggles began to show on the outside. By her early teens, Amy was restless, rebellious, and unafraid to push back against authority. At 14, she was expelled from school, and she leaned into that rebellion like it was her identity. The heavy eyeliner, the bold clothes, the sharp words, these weren't just fashion choices. They were her way of building armor. Being loud, being different, being defiant became her shield. It was how she told the world, "You can't control me." But behind that armor, she was still a fragile girl, trying not to be hurt again. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard once said that despair is not willing to be oneself. That thought fits Amy's early years. She wanted to be her true self, but so often she was running from the parts of her life that hurt the most. Every act of rebellion was two things at once. It was her standing up for herself, but it was also her way of hiding the pain she carried inside. She was trying to prove she was strong, while secretly struggling to hold herself together. Yet in the middle of that struggle, her voice began to cut through. Not just as sound, but as the one part of her she couldn't hide. By the time she entered the Sylvia Young Theatre School, that voice set her apart instantly. It wasn't just talent, it was a force. Teachers and classmates could sense it. Amy wasn't just another student, she was something rare. When her debut album Frank came out in 2003, that talent exploded onto the stage of the wider world. Critics praised her for being different in a music scene dominated by pop polish. Her voice carried echoes of old soul singers, but with a modern, biting honesty that made people stop and listen. Suddenly, the girl who once built armor out of rebellion was now being celebrated as a prodigy. But with success came something quieter and far heavier: ownership. The moment Frank hit, Amy wasn't just Amy anymore. She became the jazz prodigy, the voice of her generation. Her gift, once personal, now belonged to everyone else. Crowds, critics, the industry, all of them leaned in, expecting more. What had started as a joy, a way to express herself, was slowly becoming a duty. Psychologists call this role engulfment. It's when one part of your identity consumes everything else. For Amy, it wasn't just that she could sing. It was that singing became all she was allowed to be. The girl with sharp humor, messy emotions, and a need for freedom began disappearing behind the image of the brilliant new star. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said that talent is both a light and a weight. It can illuminate your path, but it can also burn you with its intensity. For Amy, the light of her talent dazzled the world, but its weight began pressing down before she even realized it. The gift that had carried her away from pain was now binding her to new pressures. She was no longer the girl experimenting with sound in her room. She was the artist who had to keep proving herself, album after album, performance after performance. The voice that had once been her escape was already turning into another cage. If Frank introduced her as a rising voice, Back to Black turned her into a brand. The eyeliner, the beehive, the heartbreak lyrics, These weren't just her style anymore. They became the costume others insisted she wear. Songs like Rehab weren't just music, they were headlines, shaping how the world thought of her. What had once been personal expression was now packaging, and the industry made sure the image came before the woman. Philosopher Jean Baudrillard called this hyperreality, when the image of a person becomes more powerful than their reality. That's what happened to Amy. Amy the icon was everywhere, while Amy the woman disappeared. Her pain wasn't hidden, it was marketed. Her resistance wasn't a struggle, it was content. Even her most vulnerable song, Rehab, was consumed as entertainment. Psychologists Gordon Flett and Paul Hewitt describe a trap called socially prescribed perfectionism. It's when the weight of other people's expectations suffocates you. For Amy, this was constant. Audiences wanted the tragic jazz genius. Managers wanted the profitable brand. And when she stumbled, the backlash was harsher than the applause had ever been. The irony is that Amy was never chasing flawlessness. She was messy, raw, unpredictable. That's what made her music real. But the machine built around her demanded that she stay in character, even when it destroyed her. Each award, each chart-topping single, each magazine cover pulled her deeper into that cage. The girl who sang to free herself was now trapped inside the very image that made her famous. But while the industry controlled her public life, her private life was unraveling in ways just as dangerous. At the center of it all was Blake Fielder Civil, the man who would become both her partner and her undoing. Their relationship was magnetic but combustible. From the beginning, it swung between passion and chaos. Fights, reconciliations, drugs, and declarations that neither could let go. To Amy, Blake wasn't just a partner. He was a reflection of the turmoil she'd always known. The instability she first learned at home seemed to find its echo in him. Psychologists call this trauma bonding. John Bowlby's work on attachment shows how early wounds can pull us toward the very patterns that hurt us most. For Amy, Blake embodied that pattern. Their love was intense, consuming, and laced with pain. But it was also familiar. It felt like the kind of love she had been conditioned to recognize, the kind that hurts as much as it holds. And because of that, she clung to it. Even when it dragged her deeper into addiction, even when the tabloids turned their marriage into a circus, even when Blake's imprisonment left her spiraling alone, Amy kept returning to him. To outsiders, it looked like self-destruction. To Amy, it felt like survival. The bond was a chain as much as it was a connection, binding her even when it broke her. The philosopher Simone de Beauvoir once wrote that real love is rooted in freedom, in seeing and supporting the other as their own person. But Amy's love with Blake did the opposite. It closed in on her, limiting her choices, deepening her chains. What should have been a refuge became another battlefield, where every embrace seemed to pull her closer to collapse. The tragedy was that she wasn't just fighting the industry or the public anymore. She was fighting the person she loved most. And that fight, more than any headline or award, left her with scars the world could never see. To numb those wounds, Amy turned to the only refuge left within reach: drugs and alcohol. For her, addiction wasn't about chasing euphoria, it was about finding silence. Crack cocaine, heroin, and heavy drinking became her way of quieting the storm inside. On stage, she was expected to deliver perfection. In her marriage, she was consumed by chaos. And in the spotlight, she was reduced to an image. Substances gave her a break from all of it, even if only for a moment. Her most famous song, Rehab, captured the contradiction. They tried to make me go to rehab. I said no, no, no. To the public, it was catchy. To Amy, it was personal. It was her defiance turned into an anthem. Her way of saying that being forced into help without being heard wasn't healing. It was another cage. But what most missed was the deeper truth. The culture laughed at her refusal while ignoring the pain underneath it. Psychologist Gabor Mate has argued that addiction isn't about the drug itself. It's about the pain that makes the drug necessary. For Amy, the substances weren't weakness, they were survival. They dulled the ache of abandonment, the pressure of perfection, the weight of being Amy Winehouse instead of simply Amy. But survival has a cost. Aristotle once warned that virtue lies in balance, and excess destroys the harmony of the soul. Addiction is excess at its most merciless. What began as a way to cope soon became another prison. The relief she sought in the haze of drugs and drink came with sharper falls, harsher consequences and deeper wounds. And the world watched it happen. Instead of compassion, her struggle became a spectacle. Tabloids photographed her stumbles. Fans debated whether she would ever pull herself together. Every relapse became a headline, every step toward recovery another story to sell. Addiction wasn't just eating away at her privately, it was consumed by millions as entertainment. Yet at its core, Amy's addiction was never about destroying herself. It was about protecting the fragile parts of her that no one else seemed willing to protect. The irony is haunting. The very thing she turned to for relief ended up amplifying her collapse. And while her private battles deepened, the world outside turned them into a public show. By the late 2000s, Amy's struggle wasn't only private, it had become public property. Cameras didn't just capture her, they stalked her. Paparazzi camped outside her home, chased her down streets, and waited for her to stumble so that a single image could be sold as the day's story. What should have been private moments, her exhaustion, her arguments, her relapses, were turned into front-page entertainment. Late-night shows made jokes out of her pain. Reality TV and interviews weren't interested in her healing. They wanted spectacle, a glimpse of the train wreck audiences were told to expect. Sociologist Irving Goffman described stigma as the process by which one flaw, once visible, becomes the entire identity. That's what happened to Amy. She wasn't seen as the artist behind Back to Black anymore. She was reduced to the addict, the mess, the problem. One label swallowed all the others, and once it stuck, the world refused to see anything else. Philosopher Hannah Arendt warned that when a person's life becomes a spectacle, their dignity disappears. Amy was no longer treated as a woman, a daughter, or a friend. She was treated as a story to consume, a cautionary tale to laugh at, a headline to scroll past. The crowd that once rose to cheer her brilliance now leaned in to watch her unravel. And the cruelest part? The more the world stared, the more isolated she became. Friends pulled back under the weight of the spotlight. Strangers felt entitled to comment on her every move. In a life already stripped of safety, there was no corner free of eyes, no space to breathe without judgment. Amy's collapse didn't just happen in private. It was staged in front of millions, with cameras clicking as the curtain fell. What began as a gift that connected people had turned into a trap that left her disconnected, unseen, and consumed by the very audience that once adored her. And soon, that same spectacle turned on the one thing that had carried her from the beginning, her voice. The stage, once her refuge, became the sharpest mirror of her decline. Audiences who had once held their breath for her effortless power now witnessed missed notes, forgotten lyrics, and shows that ended in boos instead of standing ovations. The cruelest moment came in 2011 in Belgrade, one of her final major concerts. She stumbled onto the stage, unable to perform, and was booed by tens of thousands who had come to see the legend. For many, that night was the confirmation that Amy had collapsed beyond repair. For her, it was public humiliation, broadcast around the world. Psychologists call this moment role exit, the painful process of losing the very identity that once defined you. For Amy, her role had never just been singer. It had been her shield, her purpose, her proof that she was worth something. And now, as the voice faltered, so did the role. Without it, she wasn't just losing concerts, she was losing herself. Philosopher Martin Heidegger warned about the danger of reducing a human being to their function. When the function fails, the person is discarded. That's what Amy experienced. To the world, she was valuable as long as she could sing with brilliance. Once that brilliance cracked, she wasn't offered grace, she was pushed aside. The woman who once carried entire arenas with a single note now faced silence between them. The tragedy wasn't just that her voice weakened, it was that compassion weakened with it. The world mistook her unraveling for failure, and in that mistake, they began to turn away. As the spotlight dimmed, Amy wasn't only losing her voice, she was losing her circle. Fame had filled her world with faces, yet it left her with fewer and fewer people she could truly trust. Friends who once felt close began to distance themselves, wary of the chaos that followed her name. Some tried to help, others quietly pulled away. Strangers, meanwhile, acted like they knew her best, filling the silence with judgments. Fame made her visible everywhere. Magazines, headlines, gossip sites, but it left her unseen inside. The more her life was broadcast, the more alone she became. In the crowd of millions who claimed to know Amy Winehouse, the real Amy faded further into the shadows. Psychologist John Cacioppo's research on loneliness shows that chronic isolation doesn't just hurt emotionally, It deepens despair and worsens addiction. Human beings need connection to heal, but Amy's fame denied her that possibility. Every attempt at recovery was drowned out by the noise of a culture that wanted her drama more than her healing. The very visibility that made her a star magnified her solitude. Philosopher Albert Camus once wrote about the absurdity of existence, the tension of living under forces that strip life of meaning. For Amy, this wasn't philosophy, it was daily reality. To be watched constantly, judged endlessly, and yet unseen as a person is one of the cruelest contradictions anyone can endure. What fame gave her in applause, it took back in loneliness. By the end, Amy's world was full of eyes, but empty of understanding. She was surrounded, yet profoundly alone. The crowds had watched, the cameras had followed, and then, suddenly, the noise stopped. July 23, 2011, London. Amy Winehouse died of alcohol poisoning at 27. The headlines rushed to place her in the 27 Club, as if a myth could explain a human life. But her death wasn't a symbol, it was a loss. A daughter, a friend, an artist, gone. What ended that day hadn't started that day. It was the last chapter of a long erosion. Early fractures at home, a gift that consumed her, an industry that turned a person into a product, a love that bound more than it freed, a culture that watched instead of helped, and an illness that promised relief but tightened the trap. Her final hour wasn't the beginning of collapse. It was the point where years of pressure finally gave way. People played the records and spoke about legacy, but the truth is harder. Amy was a young woman who needed space to heal and rarely got it. Viktor Frankl wrote that survival depends on meaning, but Amy's story shows how meaning can be buried under relentless weight. Not by one act, but by 1,000 small cuts. Expectations without care, attention without empathy, fame without safety. Her death should not make a myth feel tidy. It should make our grief honest. The voice that moved millions belonged to a person who needed gentleness more than applause. And in the silence she left behind, we were reminded of what her songs always carried beneath the melody. A plea to be seen, not just watched. And that plea still speaks to us now. Amy's collapse was never only her story. It was a reflection of how we treat fragile brilliance. We applauded the gift, but overlooked the person. We turned her pain into spectacle, and in doing so, forgot the woman behind the voice. Carl Jung once said that what we repress eventually returns in destructive ways. Amy's longing for love and freedom, buried beneath fame and expectation, came back as collapse. We mourned the sound, but too often forgot the soul. And maybe the harder question is this: how many more voices will we lose because we still refuse to hear the person behind them? Share your reflections below, and if this story moved you, subscribe for more. Because remembering Amy means remembering the human, not just the icon.